The morning of the announcement had dawned gray and heavy over London, a sky the color of old pewter pressing down upon the spires of Westminster. Inside the gilded confines of a private audience chamber in Buckingham Palace, the air was thick with a century of protocol and unspoken truths. King Charles III, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, stood with his back to the room, gazing out at the rain beginning to speckle the windows of the garden quadrangle. He looked every inch the monarch he had spent a lifetime preparing to become. Yet the weight on his shoulders seemed to press him deeper into the floor with each passing second. Before him, on a sprawling mahogany desk, lay the final draft of a statement that would alter the course of the monarchy forever. It was not a political decree, nor a matter of state, and it was personal, raw, and devastatingly final. It concerned his wife, Queen Camilla. For decades, Camilla had navigated the treacherous waters of public opinion with a stoicism that bordered on the heroic. She had been the other woman, the villain in a real-life fairy tale, the source of the most profound crack in the House of Windsor since the abdication. She had endured a hailstorm of criticism, been blamed for the collapse of Charles's marriage to the beloved Diana, and slowly, painstakingly, worked to rehabilitate her image. By the time of the coronation, she had seemed to achieve the impossible, a measure of public acceptance, even affection. She stood beside her king, a consort crowned and anointed. But the ghosts of the past do not simply vanish because a crown is placed upon a head. They linger in the shadows, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. The decision had not been made lightly. It had been a festering wound for years, one that recent events had cruelly ripped open. It was the unexpected publication of old, deeply personal letters. Letters Charles had written to Camilla during the darkest days of his first marriage that had finally tipped the scales. The letters, leaked from a source who claimed to want to set the historical record straight, were not scandalous in a prurient sense. They were far worse. They were intimate, yearning, and filled with a desperate love that laid bare the profound emotional void at the heart of his life with Diana. They painted a picture of a man trapped by duty and tradition, seeking solace in the one person he felt truly understood him. The public reaction was a complicated mix of sympathy for the young, a conflicted prince, and a resurgence of the old, bitter narrative about Camilla's role. The delicate equilibrium shattered. Polls showed a dramatic swing in public sentiment, with calls for Camilla to step back from public life growing louder and more insistent. Charles had initially resisted, his protective instincts for the woman he had loved for over 50 years flaring with a regal defiance. He had seen her strength, her loyalty, her unwavering support through his own struggles. To him, she was his rock, his darling wife, as he had so publicly called her. But the institution of the monarchy is larger than any one man, even a king. His advisers, led by his private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, presented a relentless case. They spoke not of blame, but of survival. The monarchy, they argued, there was a delicate ecosystem that thrived on public goodwill. The resurgence of the old scandal was poisoning the well. It was distracting from the king's own ambitious environmental and social initiatives, overshadowing his work and tarnishing the crown itself. They presented him with private polling data, focus group transcripts, and editorials from newspapers that had once been staunchly royalist. The message was clear. For the good of the institution he was sworn to protect, a sacrifice was needed. And that sacrifice was Camilla. The final conversation had taken place the previous evening, in the quiet of their private apartments. It was a conversation devoid of the formalities of court. There were no advisors, no protocol, just a man and a woman who had known each other for the better part of a lifetime. Charles, and his voice heavy with a grief he could barely contain, had laid the reality before her. He had told her about the relentless pressure, the threat to the crown, the potential for the scandal to destabilize everything they had worked for. He had spoken of his duty, a word that had shaped and in many ways broken his life. Camilla had listened in silence, her expression unreadable. She was a woman of immense composure, a skill honed by decades of silent endurance. When he had finished, a long, profound silence filled the room. Then she had simply nodded. She understood. She had always understood the cruel arithmetic of royal life. She knew that her love for him, the very thing that had sustained them both, was now the weapon being used against the crown. Her quiet acquiescence was, in its own way, more devastating than any outburst of anger. Now, standing at the window, Charles turned as a soft knock announced the arrival of his wife. Camilla entered, dressed simply in a cream-colored dress, her expression serene but for the faintest tightening around her eyes. She walked to him and took his hand, her grip firm and cool. They stood together, two people alone in a room full of history, facing the precipice. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice calm, devoid of self-pity. He looked into her eyes, seeing not the queen, not the consort, but the woman he had loved against all odds. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I will never be ready for this." The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 11. It was time. He squeezed her hand once more, then let go, straightening his shoulders as the monarch must. But he walked towards the door, towards the cameras, towards a future he had never imagined. Behind him, Camilla remained perfectly still, a solitary figure framed by the gray London light, about to be written out of the story she had spent her entire life trying to be a part of. The world outside the palace walls was a frenzy of speculation. News of a significant royal announcement concerning the Queen had leaked, and the press was in a feeding frenzy. Television trucks lined the streets, and social media was ablaze with conjecture. Was she ill? Was she stepping down? Had there been a rift in the marriage? No one could have guessed the truth. In the palace briefing room, a sea of journalists fell silent as the king's press secretary stepped to the podium. "His Majesty the King has asked me to read a personal statement," she began, and her voice steady. The room held its breath. The statement began with the usual formalities, but then it shifted. It spoke of a period of deep reflection, of the immense weight of history, and of a need to ensure the future stability of the monarchy. It then arrived at its devastating core. "After extensive consultation and with the heaviest of hearts, my wife, the Queen, and I have come to a difficult decision regarding her role. To allow my work as sovereign to remain focused on the service of our nation and realms, unencumbered by the persistent distractions of the past, the Queen will be withdrawing from all official public duties. She will retain her title, but will no longer represent the royal family at public engagements, nor will she accompany me on state occasions. She has made this sacrifice willingly, out of her profound love for me and her deep and abiding commitment to the crown. I ask that her privacy and dignity be respected during this time." A collective gasp seemed to suck the air from the room. Camilla, the Queen, was being effectively banished from public life. The reaction was immediate and global. Shockwaves rippled through the stock exchange of public opinion. In living rooms across Britain and the Commonwealth, the announcement was met with stunned silence. The narrative had been flipped. For decades, Camilla had been cast as the manipulative mistress, the schemer who finally got her crown. Now, in a single, breathtaking moment, she was being repositioned as the tragic sacrifice, the woman cast aside to save the very institution she had been accused of tarnishing. The press scrambled to rewrite their headlines, and the narrative of the wicked other woman suddenly felt clumsy and inadequate. In its place, a more complex and, for many, a more uncomfortable story began to emerge. It was the story of a king, bound by duty, forced to choose between his love for his wife and his love for his country. And in that choice, for all his power, He appeared profoundly, heartbreakingly human, a man caught in an impossible trap of his own making. The days that followed were a strange, suspended reality within the palace. For Camilla, there was no dramatic packing of bags, no tearful farewell. Her life, in its physical form, remained the same. She still resided in their apartments at Clarence House in Balmoral. But a subtle, chilling distance had been inserted into the very fabric of her existence. She was now a ghost in her own home, present but not participating. When foreign dignitaries arrived for state visits, she was absent. When the king attended the opening of Parliament, he rode alone in the carriage. The royal rota, the daily schedule of public engagements, was scrubbed clean of her name. Her private office, a bustling hub of activity just days before, fell into a stunned and sorrowful silence. Her devoted staff, who had helped her navigate the complexities of royal life for years, were given new assignments or faced an uncertain future. The silence was the loudest noise of all. Charles, meanwhile, threw himself into his work with a ferocious, almost manic energy. He crisscrossed the country, visiting community projects, hosting diplomatic receptions, and delivering speech after speech. On the surface, he was the epitome of a dedicated monarch. He finally free to pursue his life's work without the shadow of the past. But those closest to him saw the toll it was taking. The light in his eyes, the one that only appeared when Camilla was in the room, had dimmed. He was performing the role of king with technical brilliance, but the warmth, the genuine human connection that had always been his trademark, felt muted, rehearsed. At night, in the vast, silent corridors of the palace, the separation was a physical ache. They were under the same roof, yet worlds apart. They would share a quiet dinner in their private quarters, but the conversation was careful, measured, tiptoeing around the enormous, unspoken presence of his decision. The easy intimacy of a 50-year partnership had been replaced by a polite, heartbreaking formality. He had, in trying to save the monarchy, created a personal prison far more isolating than any he had known before. For the public, the initial shock began to curdle into a more complex set of emotions. The announcement, designed to put an end to the distractions of the past, had instead opened a Pandora's box of new questions. Commentators and historians began to dissect the decision with surgical precision. Was it a masterstroke of political strategy, a ruthless but necessary move to protect the crown? Or was it a catastrophic error, a sacrifice of a loyal and dedicated partner on the altar of public opinion, which was, by its very nature, fickle and unforgiving? The letters that had sparked the crisis were re-examined. Far from being a scandalous betrayal, they were now seen by many as a tragic testament to a man trapped in an unhappy marriage, of finding solace in his one true love. The public's perception of Camilla began a strange, rapid metamorphosis. The more she remained silent, the more dignified she appeared in her seclusion, the more she seemed to grow in stature. She became a figure of quiet tragedy, a woman who had finally, after a lifetime of waiting, achieved her heart's desire, only to have it cruelly taken away by the very institution she had sought to join. This shift in public sentiment was not lost on the palace advisors. The strategy was backfiring spectacularly. Instead of killing the story, they had given it new life. The focus had not shifted entirely to the king's work, it had merely pivoted to a new, and in many ways more compelling drama, The Solitary Queen. The Free Camilla hashtags that began trending on social media were an irony that was not lost on anyone who knew the story. The woman once vilified was now being cast as a victim. The press, ever hungry for a narrative, lapped it up. Paparazzi staked out Clarence House, capturing grainy images of Camilla walking her dogs in the garden, her face a mask of serene composure. Each photograph was pored over for clues, for a hint of sadness, for any crack in the facade. Her silence was a masterclass in quiet dignity, and it spoke volumes. It told the world that she was above the fray, that she accepted the king's decision not with bitterness, but with the stoic grace of a woman who understood duty better than most. The first major test of the new order came with the annual Commonwealth Day service at Westminster Abbey. It was a glittering event, a showcase of the royal family and the unity of the nations. The previous year, Camilla had stood proudly beside her husband, a queen in full regalia. This year, the king processed alone down the aisle, his face a solemn mask. The empty space beside him in the royal pew was a void that screamed louder than any fanfare. The television cameras, in a mix of sympathy and sensationalism, kept cutting to the seat, a visual reminder of the sacrifice. The service itself was beautiful, the choir's voices soaring to the ancient rafters. But for Charles, the words of unity and fellowship felt hollow. He could feel the eyes of the congregation upon him, a mixture of pity and curiosity. He was surrounded by hundreds of people, yet he had never felt more alone. That night, back at the palace, the silence between him and Camilla was heavier than ever. They didn't discuss the service. They didn't need to. Its profound emptiness had been the only topic of conversation required. Weeks turned into months. The initial media storm subsided into a steady, low-level hum of curiosity. Camilla adapted to her new life with a resilience that surprised even those who knew her best. She channeled her energy into her private passions, her reading, her gardening, and her beloved dogs. She maintained a close circle of loyal friends who visited regularly, providing a lifeline to the world outside the gilded cage. She never once, in private conversation, criticized her husband's decision. She defended it, in fact, insisting that it was necessary, that the crown must come first. But her friends saw the sadness in her eyes. The way her gaze would linger on television footage of the king at an engagement, a fleeting look of longing crossing her face before she would firmly turn away. She was a queen without a kingdom, a partner in a partnership that could only be expressed in stolen private moments. For Charles, the separation became a source of profound, unspoken guilt. He saw the strength she was displaying, a strength born of a lifetime of weathering storms. And he knew, with a certainty that gnawed at his soul, that he had created this particular storm. He began to find the relentless pace of his public duties a burden rather than a calling. The smiles he offered to well-wishers were becoming harder to summon. The speeches, once a source of passionate purpose, now felt like lines recited by an actor in a play he no longer believed in. The machine of monarchy was functioning perfectly, but the heart of the monarch was slowly, quietly breaking. He started to spend more time in his study late at night, not working, but simply sitting, staring into the flames of the fire, lost in thought. The letters on his desk, matters of state, went unattended. His thoughts were elsewhere, in the other wing of the palace, with the woman he had, in the name of duty, been forced to abandon. The turning point, when it came, was as quiet and unexpected as a single snowflake falling in a still forest. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Charles was in his study, reviewing papers for an upcoming Privy Council meeting, his mind struggling to focus. There was a soft knock at the door. He called out, "Enter," expecting a private secretary with another schedule to approve. The door opened, and Camilla walked in. She was dressed in a simple wax jacket, her hair slightly damp from the rain. In her hands, she held a small, battered cardboard box. She didn't speak, but walked over to his desk and placed the box gently in front of him. He looked at it, then up at her, a question in his tired eyes. "Open it," she said, her voice soft. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a collection of trinkets, the archaeological artifacts of their long, secret history. There was a single perfect pheasant feather from a long-ago walk in the Scottish Highlands, its barb still intact. There was a smooth, flat stone from a beach in Cornwall, a place they had visited in the brief, precious window between the end of his marriage to Diana and the full glare of the public firestorm. There was a ticket stub from a tiny, obscure cinema in London where they had once watched a French film, hiding in the back row like teenagers. There were a few of the infamous letters, the very ones that had sparked the recent crisis, but these were different. These were the early ones, filled not with the desperation of a trapped man, but with the giddy, breathless joy of new and forbidden love. And at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small, slightly squashed biscuit, tied with a faded pink ribbon. He looked at the biscuit, utterly bewildered. Camilla smiled, a real smile, the first he had seen in months. "It's a shortbread," she said. "From the first time you ever came to my grandmother's house. You were so nervous, you kept crumbling it into your tea. Afterwards, you couldn't stop talking about how good it was. I saved it. A piece of history. My own personal royal souvenir." A sound escaped Charles's lips, something between a laugh and a sob. He looked at the collection, this haphazard museum of their shared life, and he saw it for what it was. A testament not to scandal or duty, but to a simple, enduring, and deeply human love. It was made of walks and shared secrets and silly souvenirs. It was made of crumbled biscuits and stolen afternoons. It was the opposite of the cold, gilded, and brutally pragmatic world of the monarchy. He looked up at her, his eyes glistening. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because I wanted you to remember," she said, sitting down in the chair opposite him. "Not the Queen, not the scandal, not the duty. I wanted you to remember us, just us, the two people who loved each other in a world that didn't want them to. That love is still here. Charles. It's in this box, and it's in this room. It hasn't gone anywhere, even if we can't walk down an aisle together." Her words were a balm and a blade. They soothed the ache of loneliness, but also cut deep into the wound of his decision. He had been so focused on saving the institution, on managing the crisis, that he had forgotten what he was supposedly trying to protect. The monarchy was not just an institution, it was his life. And his life, its very core, its only true meaning, was sitting right in front of him, offering him a crumbled biscuit as a token of 50 years of love. He reached across the desk and took her hand. For a long time they just sat there, the rain pattering against the window, the box of memories open between them. In the silence, a revolution was taking place. The king was remembering how to be a man. And the quiet revolution in the king's study began to take shape in the days that followed. The box of memories stayed on his desk, a constant, tangible reminder of what truly mattered. The change was subtle at first. He started asking his private secretary to schedule more private time in his diary, time he spent not working, but simply being with Camilla. They would take long, rain-soaked walks in the palace gardens, their heads bent close together in conversation, their dogs bounding ahead, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring behind the palace walls. They resurrected old routines, listening to classical music in the evening, reading passages from books aloud to each other, cooking simple meals together with the help of a bewildered but delighted palace chef. And the polite formality that had encased their relationship began to crack and fall away, replaced by the warm, familiar intimacy of their shared past. This renewal did not go unnoticed. The tabloids, starved of royal drama, ran headlines about the king's newfound happiness and the queen's secret garden walks. The public, ever eager for a love story, watched with bated breath. The narrative was shifting again. The story was no longer about a sacrificed queen, but about a king who seemed to be rediscovering his soul. It was a dangerous narrative for the palace, for it directly challenged the wisdom of the original decision. If the king was happier, more relaxed, and more effective when he was with his wife, what did that say about the logic of separating them? The advisors who had pushed for the announcement began to grow uneasy. and the carefully constructed plan was unraveling, not through any public defiance from the king, but through the simple, irrefutable power of human connection. The opportunity for a public reckoning arrived sooner than anyone expected, in the form of the annual Royal Variety performance. It was a major event on the royal calendar, a glittering night of entertainment attended by senior members of the family. The original plan, crafted in the aftermath of the announcement, was for the king to attend alone, a solitary figure in the royal box. But as the date approached, Charles made a decision. He did not ask for permission. He did not consult his advisors for a poll-tested strategy. He simply informed Sir Clive Alderton of his intention. The Queen would be accompanying him. The private secretary, his face a mask of professional composure, stammered a few objections, citing protocol, the potential for media frenzy, the risk of undoing all the good work of the past months. The king listened patiently, then fixed him with a look that was calm, regal, and utterly immovable. "Clive," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "the monarchy is not an abstraction. It is a family, and it is time my family was seen to be whole again." The night of the performance, the atmosphere outside the London Palladium was electric. A massive crowd had gathered, 10 deep behind the barriers, their breath forming small clouds in the cold November air. The rumors had spread like wildfire. Camilla was coming. When the royal car pulled up, a hush fell over the crowd, followed by a roar of sound as the door opened. The king stepped out first, resplendent in white tie and tails, and then he turned, the offering his hand. Camilla emerged, wearing a deep emerald gown that seemed to capture the very essence of the season, a simple but stunning diamond necklace at her throat. She looked radiant, not with the polished sheen of a royal on duty, but with a genuine, almost incandescent happiness. As they walked towards the theater entrance, the crowd erupted. There were cheers, yes, but more than that, there was a palpable wave of emotion. People were crying, waving, shouting, "Good on you, love," and "Welcome back, ma'am." It was not the applause of subjects for their queen. It was the embrace of a public for two people in whom they now saw a reflection of their own struggles, their own compromises, their own enduring hopes for love. Charles paused for a moment on the red carpet, his hand still holding Camilla's. He looked at the crowd, and at the flashing cameras, at the sheer, overwhelming wave of public affection. He had spent a lifetime seeking approval, first as a prince, now as a king. He had made decisions based on duty, on protocol, on the advice of those who claimed to know the public mind. But in this moment, he understood. The public mind was not a focus group or a poll. It was this, a collection of human hearts, capable of forgiveness, of empathy, of recognizing a love that had endured against all odds. He had made the biggest mistake of his life in trying to protect the crown from its own history. But in that mistake, he had been forced to confront what the crown truly meant. It was not about avoiding scandal. It was about embodying the enduring, resilient, and often messy reality of human life. And at its heart, standing beside him, her hand in his, was the woman who had taught him that lesson. He squeezed her hand, and she looked up at him, her eyes shining with a light that no palace advisor could ever dim. Together, they walked into the theater, not as a king and his sequestered queen, but as a couple, whole again, ready to face the music together.